Thanks for watching this video about German amphibious operations of the First and Second World Wars. I produced this video because I wrote an article for War and History about Operation Sealion, and the reviewers asked me to produce a list of comparable operations that the Germans had been involved in to see if they could have been successful in those operations, and if also to talk about their experience. So the main operation in the First World War was called Operation Albion, which was invasion of the Baltic Islands, and that had some effects on the organization of the German army and also on the subsequent operations in the Second World War, but generally its lessons were forgotten. But the interesting thing, of course, is that there have been several German amphibious operations, and of course, even to say German amphibious operations is an unusual thing to say, and most people would not think in that term at all. So, as I mentioned, Operation Albion was the first one, and this involved a naval battle, the Battle of Moon Sound, against Tsarist Russian forces, which the Germans won, and they also used special horse landing barges, which were unpowered, but they were successful. They realized that they needed to have a fast reaction force, and for this they carried 2 battalions of cyclists who were to advance quickly onto the islands and cut the Russian retreat. The forces involved were actually quite large. The Germans had 24,000 soldiers, and the Russians had a similar number of men. So this wasn't just a small, non-consequential operation. The operation was a success for the Germans, but they realized that afterwards that there was a need for better multi-service coordination. And this led to the establishment of the OKW in 1938, but unfortunately that was taken over by Hitler as his secretariat and never really used as a coordinating body for the different armed services of the Wehrmacht. They also initiated a project for building an army landing craft, but that of course went very slowly, and they still only had one at the end of 1940. The next and probably best known operation is Operation Weserübung. Sorry if I got the pronunciation wrong. Weserübung. So the invasion of Norway and Denmark in 9th of April 1940. This really showed the capabilities of the German army at its peak, where they were transporting troops and landing them up nearly 1,500 kilometers apart from one another, all over the place. And they were using 6 divisions, about 6 on the Allied side. There were 60,000 for Denmark, and the Allies had 35,000, including Polish and French and British troops. The Germans had 9 divisions, and they had just a few tanks. And they used the entire German Navy, what there was of it, and most of the heavy elements of the fleet and most of the destroyers were destroyed in this action, but it was a success. And another unique aspect to this was that there was an attempt to have a unified command where General Falkenhorst was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the operation. Now on these pages, you'll notice that I've listed the amount of time there was for planning. So for instance, this one, there was just over 2 months to plan the operation. And the reason for this is because with the Operation Sealion having only 3 months to plan it, from July till September, to plan the operation, that's one of the arguments. People say, well, it couldn't possibly have succeeded. And as you can see with Visa Urban, which was every bit as complicated, and they only had 2 months to plan it, and it succeeded. Although, of course, in Narvik, the German troops were about to surrender, or at least run away to Sweden when the Allies evacuated because of the goings on in France. Another aspect of the Visa Urban operation was the German torpedoes, which hit a lot of British ships. There were some British ships that suffered severe damage from air attacks, but it was the Royal Navy seemed to be very much averse to the threat of air attacks, and they declared part of the North Sea as a no-go zone for the Royal Navy ships. That's the bit closest to Norway, between Norway and Denmark. And there was one ship that I think was an aircraft carrier that a single bomb landed near the ship. It was a near miss, but it unseated the drive shafts, so it had to go home immediately. Another heavy cruiser was hit by an air attack and arrived back in Scotland with its decks awash. But on the whole, the German air attacks weren't that dreadful. But the Royal Navy didn't perceive it that way. They really were scared by the air attacks. And this was one of the things that would have led into Operation Sealion, was the attitude of the Navy of the Royal Navy, that is, to air attacks. And that was a key point in the German plan, was that they were going to try to overwhelm the Royal Navy with air attacks. And of course, one of the instances where things could have been very different is the torpedoing of the battleship, I think it was HMS Nelson, which was the flagship of the Home Fleet, and so it had Nelson, it had the Admiral of the Home Fleet on board, as well as Churchill at the time, and it was hit by several torpedoes, but none of them failed to go off. And that happened on other occasions as well. So the fact that the Royal Navy came out of it fairly unscathed, except for a few losses, like they lost the one aircraft carrier and a few cruisers and stuff. It could have been quite different. So that brings us to Operation Sealion and the characteristics of Operation Sealion. So for Sealion, they eventually assembled 3,000 to 4,000 vessels. You probably don't believe me, but there were at least there were nearly 2,000 barges, which even after the air attacks on the ports was like 1,800 barges. And there were lots of small motorboats, which is why there were so many, 1,200 motorboats that were used for command. In the first wave, the Germans had 9 divisions of 67,000 men, plus a parachute division. And about 1,800 armored vehicles were included in that, which, and in the follow-up divisions, they had about 5 panzer divisions. In the initial wave, there was about the equivalent of a panzer division spread amongst the various troops of specialist tank types. And defending against them, there were between 27 and 29 divisions of equivalent. about 400,000 men, plus a million men of the Home Guard. But of course, the thing about it was that only four infantry divisions were fully equipped and trained, and there were 2 armored divisions, but they also had their problems. And the beach fortifications were in many ways improvised and of poor quality. So were the defending guns. So, for instance, the 6-inch guns that were set up, which were taken from First World War ships, only had limited ammunition, and a lot of the ammunition was faulty. So they were told basically not to fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And of course, the thing about Operation Sealion was that it was cancelled because the Germans didn't get air superiority in the Battle of Britain. The next operation, invasion of an island that was similar, was the invasion of Crete in May 1941. This was meant to be mainly an airborne operation, and they nearly failed. And it's just, they were just lucky that, you know, a New Zealand commander misunderstood his orders and ordered his troops to leave a hill that was overlooking the main airfield, and because of that, the Germans were able to eventually occupy the airfield and start landing all the rest of their troops. The amphibious operations, there were a couple, and they were basically unsuccessful. They were either turned back or sunk, except for an Italian operation which went to the south of the island and came from the east. This operation, they only had 3 weeks to plan it. And it was another operation where the Germans did have air superiority, but the number of troops they had invading were actually, you know, they only had about half as many troops as there were actually on the island. Of course, they were of all sorts of standards. So when Germany invaded Russia, the same situation came up again, that they needed to invade the Baltic Islands again, and this was called Operation Beowulf II and Siegfried, and this involved 1 infantry division and 150 Brandenburger commandos, so 50 of which landed by gliders. And they used all the equipment that they'd created for Operation Sealion. So one of the things about Sealion is that it extended the Second World War because it created all this equipment for the Germans and trained troops to use it, which they then used over and over again, and as we'll see, this led to troops surviving or succeeding where it would not otherwise have been possible. This invasion of the islands was actually when they first used the Me-321 Gigant gliders, which were enormous aircraft, which were designed for invading Britain with tanks. They had 3 months to plan for this, and of course they probably looked up what they'd done previously. And so then we had we had more amphibious operations around the Crimea, and the first of these was Operation Trappenjagd, which was the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula, and that involved a flanking attack using assault boats. They had one regiment from the 132 Division using about 75 Sturmboots. The Russians had a much larger defending force, but they weren't expecting this attack. And the Germans had air superiority. So this operation was one of Manstein's greatest victories because the Germans won against enormous odds on the part of the Russians, and also the terrain was like a narrow peninsula which they were attacking, and it didn't favour them at all. But again, it was a German success. So let's have a look at some more of these. The next few we'll have Storfang, Hercules, Blucher 2, Eisbar, Brunhild, and Leopard Typhon. And you'll see that these operations are often characterized by having air superiority is a major point, and surprise, and also using, and one other major point is that the Germans didn't use specialist troops. And of course, that's another point about Operation Sealion, is that the Germans would not have used specialized troops except for some commandos and a few Marines. They would have just used normal troops. So Operation Storfang was the amphibious assault on Sevastopol, the final assault, where they crossed Severnaya Bay into the town and into the rear of the fortifications. They used 700 men, and the assault was a complete. They used various methods to hide the noise of the boats, so the Russians didn't hear them coming, and it was a complete surprise and a complete success, and also a crucial part of the success of the whole operation, of the final capture of Sevastopol by the Germans. Next, we have another operation that didn't happen, but was planned in great detail and also prepared for in great detail, just like Operation Sealion, which is Operation Hercules, which was the proposed invasion of Malta, which was scheduled to happen in mid-July 1942. You can see there's some pictures of the Russian tanks that the Germans were going to use, because at the time they didn't have any real heavy tanks or tanks with the type of armor or armament that the Russians did. So that was just one aspect of it. The Germans transported the landing barges down through the French canal system and by rail down to the Mediterranean, and the Italians built license-built versions of the same craft, and again we had the same craft that were designed for Operation Sealion about to be used to take over Malta. Whether it would have succeeded or not is another question, because they would have to, again, it would have been in the face of Royal Navy opposition, but at least on this occasion, though, they would have had the Italian Navy to help them. There wouldn't have been such a difficult operation as Sealion in the terms of the Sealion operations' main problem was, of course, the Royal Navy, which was enormous and compared to the German Navy. In this case, the Italians had parity and even superiority to the German Navy, at least in numbers, after they sank the British battleships in Alexandria Harbour and so forth. The Italians didn't know this because they settled on the bottom. But at some times during the war, the Italians actually had a superiority in battleships and so forth. Of course, they didn't have the fuel, and they also were unwilling to use them. more involved in the idea of a fleet in being. But this was another operation that apparently the Italians had actually planned to do some sort of operation from before the war. And of course, it's very stupid of them that when they declared war, they didn't launch it immediately, because they probably would have had the same effect as the German invasion of Norway and so forth, because that was one of the features of the invasion of Norway and Denmark, was that they did it while they were still neutral, and that's one of the elements of surprise. And I'm sure that if the Germans had done similar things like they did in Copenhagen Harbour, where they had a German ship full of troops that suddenly disgorged them onto the harbour, and that's one reason why they were able to take it over so easily. I'm sure they might have tried something like that. But of course, it didn't happen because although Rommel was actually a big a supporter of the operation, he decided that, you know, we've captured all this stuff in Tobruk, and we're not going to proceed with the plan anymore, which was, you know, we're going to take the plan originally was we're going to take Tobruk, and then when we've taken Malta, we will then proceed from Tobruk to Egypt. But he got a case of victory disease and decided to pursue the British out of Tobruk, because they just captured so much stuff there. And the end result being that he arrived in Egypt with only 30 working tanks, and he was beaten off. So we come to September 1942 and the crossing of the Kerch Straits, which was called Operation Blucher 2. Again, they used the landing craft for this. And it was involved a Kampfgruppe from the 46th Infantry Division, so not a terribly big operation initially. And then we jump to the end of 1943, when after the Italians surrendered, the Germans then took over the Greek islands, and some of them were actually, of course, the Dodecanese Islands in the eastern Mediterranean are actually part of Italy, and the Germans invaded them, and the British were part of the defenders. So they're actually British and Italians fighting side by side on these islands, and these were very humiliating defeats for the British, because the British had naval superiority, but the Germans had air superiority, just like in the proposal in Operation Sealion. And in many cases, the German naval forces had to travel long distances to get to the island in the face of this British naval superiority, and they still succeeded. They only had a short time to prepare it, and the numbers of men they had were generally inferior to the defending operation. And the operations in the Dodecanese Islands were classed as the last successful operations, or the last successful invasions by the Germans in the Second World War. Some call it the last British defeat, but in fact that was Operation Market Garden, which was at least a stalemate. And so from now on, most of the operations, or if not all of them, are evacuations. But again, this is where you get this idea of having all these marine firearms, MFPs, which were the landing craft, Seabull ferries. These were all craft built for Operation Sealion, and in this first evacuation of the Kuban bridgehead across the Kerch Strait, they had 2 months to prepare for it. They evacuated 15 divisions over 38 days in the face of Russian naval superiority and hardly lost anything in the process. And of course, the most famous Dodecanese Island operation was Operation Leopard or Typhoon. And that again was another humiliating British defeat, where they actually used airborne troops as well. So there was a mixture of airborne troops and also naval troops. Some of the naval troops landings were stopped by the British Navy, but not all of them. And eventually the British and Italian troops on the island surrendered. And so now we come to the final section, where again all the German operations are, except for the last one, are all evacuations of huge numbers of men. And if these evacuations had not succeeded, the war would have ended a lot sooner. First, we have Operation Sealion, or in other words, Tutorial, which was the evacuation across the Straits of Messina from Sicily to Italy, when they evacuated about 100,000 troops and their equipment, including Tiger tanks. And they only had about a week's planning and preparation for this. And the Allies had naval superiority, but or at least naval equality, but they were afraid to go into the narrow straits because of the fears of mines and so forth. And that's similar to what was to propose for Operation Sealion, which was a fairly narrow, obviously not as narrow, but the same sort of thing was the Royal Navy said, at least the commander of the Home Fleet said in a conference with the other military chiefs and Churchill that the Royal Navy major surface fleet units would not go into the English Channel because of the difficulty of maneuvering in the channel. And because the water was shallow, and because they were afraid of air attacks, and of course the minefields, which the Germans were going. Which for the Germans, there was also the Channel guns as well. In this case, it was like both sides of the channel were lined with anti-aircraft guns, and so that's why the Allied air power was not very effective. The next evacuation we had was from the Crimea and Sevastopol, when again, of course, Hitler refused to let them do it in a reasonable amount of time and left it to the last moment. But even so, they were able to evacuate 44,000 troops in just a few days from Sevastopol, and in total over 113,000 Axis troops were evacuated. And despite Russian aircraft attacking the convoys, so the Germans didn't have an air superiority, they didn't have naval superiority, but the Russians were not keen on using their major surface fleet units. And this is probably one of the most important evacuations, at least from the Western Allies' point of view, was the evacuation from the Scheldt estuary of the entire 15th Army, or 100,000 men, 9 infantry divisions across the Scheldt in front of Antwerp. This meant that the port of Antwerp stayed closed much longer than it needed, might have otherwise, and also that the island of Walcheren then had to have a major invasion done of it by the Canadians, and it was another major amphibious operation. And this also meant that because troops were able to cross over, they were able to reinforce the troops fighting the Allies in Operation Market Garden. So it contributed to the failure of Operation Market Garden. And for this particular operation, the German troops only had about 1 day's warning to plan for it. They were evacuating from ports to ports, but again, they were using the same equipment used in Operation Sealion. And of course, one of the points made about Operation Sealion is the number of horse-drawn wagons and so forth that were used by the German army. The German army for Sealion was going to replace as many as possible of the horse-drawn vehicles with captured French vehicles and so forth. But even in this particular operation, they were even able to evacuate 6,000 horse-drawn wagons. It's incredible. And another famous operation, of course, was the caused by Hitler's intransigence. That meant that the war, this probably meant actually the war was shorter because these troops got trapped in Courland and Hitler refused to evacuate them. So he kept thinking in terms of, a bridgehead that we're going to attack from this area. So we're going to hold on to it as long as possible. And in fact, many of the troops are still there at the end of the Second World War. It wasn't in January 1945. 7 divisions were evacuated. It was the same with Norway. The threat of an Allied attack on Norway, which was actually quite real because Churchill kept advocating an attack on Norway to his military chiefs, and they constantly had to persuade him not to do it. So all these troops were locked up when they could have been delaying the Russian army. In this case, it was an entire army group. And then that also led to a further evacuation, which of East Prussia and Pomerania, and this probably did involve evacuation from beaches and so forth, in which involved maybe 1 million people, who knows. And it also involved the world's worst maritime disaster, the sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff, which had more than 9,000 people were drowned. In this case, the people were travelling over 1,600 kilometres, and they still managed to do it despite Russian submarines and goodness knows what else attacking them. And finally, we have the Granville raid, which was actually launched only a month before the end of the war, and it was a success. And it involved all of the same types of ships and that were to be used in Operation Sealion. So they were going to use the German minesweepers, which were called coastal destroyers by the British because they were so large and capable, as well as the landing craft and the armed landing craft and all the rest of it. It was only a landing involving a battalion of 600 soldiers or so, but again, they weren't probably just they were just ordinary troops. There was surprise involved. They did, and their main problem turned out to be just the huge tides in that part of the world, which meant that although they captured or damaged some British ships, they were only able to get away with one of them, and also get into some of the warehouses and get some food. So it's quite laughable, really, that the objective of this raid was to get some coal and some food, because the Channel Islands garrison was starving. Yeah, but it was nevertheless a success, and quite a crazy thing that the commander wanted to do it again, but he was ordered not to by once Hitler was out of power. So we can conclude that German amphibious operations were generally successful, even though they used troops that were not specially trained and often used equipment that was not specifically made for the job. Although, of course, we have here a picture of one of the actual invasion barges, the last surviving one. It was converted from an inland barge, but there have actually been voyages across the channel by tourists in these barges, showing that they can be done. They had a lot of these operations had short planning and preparation times. 3 months seems to be quite usual, or even less. The Germans succeeded in many of these operations without having naval supremacy, and they also succeeded without having a unified command structure in most of these operations as well. There seems to have been only the one just where they made an attempt to do that. But air superiority was a factor in many of them. So it was perhaps right for the Germans to have not proceeded with the invasion of Britain without naval and air superiority. Okay, so thanks for watching.